Welcome to the Healing on Purpose podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Miriam Rahav. The content of this show is meant for informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any illness or health condition. Please discuss all information shared herein with your own personal health authority. Links to the podcast and its YouTube channel will also be available on my practice website, rahavwellness.com. Please join me on my Facebook group, Healing on Purpose Podcast with Dr. Miriam Rahav, to continue this conversation. Enjoy the show. Shalom. Shalom in Hebrew is a greeting, and it also means peace. Also, shalom comes from the root shalem, or whole. There's such wisdom in knowing that peace and wholeness are one and the same. When we are complete and when we are whole, we are at peace. And what an apt greeting when we speak about healing on purpose, because we are engaging in a conscious, purposeful, intentional seeking of our own wholeness. We are engaging in holistic medicine. And I'm so glad and so thankful you are joining me right now. Because right now, in this moment, it is the perfect time. The time you choose is always the perfect time to step onto and walk further on the divine path to healing on purpose. On purpose means with intention and with an awareness of what one is doing. In other words, with consciousness. You were made on purpose. You are here with me, and that is no accident. By healing on purpose, you heal so much more than your physical body. You connect to your divine purpose. Healing on purpose is right for you, right for me, and right for all life. It is a pathway to wholeness, individually and collectively and universally, when we all choose the pathway to healing on purpose. Thank you for consciously choosing healing. Thank you for taking this time for yourself. You deserve it. The world is better when you are healing on purpose. Today, the topic of our conversation is going to be leaky gut. Have you heard of it? It is also known as increased intestinal permeability. And it is such a key and central finding in and of itself, and its close association with so many health imbalances. Well, I think this is a great one if you are a visual learner, for me to actually show you some pictures. This one on the interwebs, courtesy of Dr. Josh X. It's an excellent graphic. And it gives you an idea of the structure of the intestinal cells. This was something that I started to learn in medical school. We have a class in our first year of medical school called histology, where we actually look at cells under the microscope. And you can see their structure, you can see their engineering. It's really uncanny and amazing to see all the details. In fact, I was trolling the interwebs and I found this image here, which I can describe for you, which is two cells. And there is a border between them where you can see these tight junctions anchoring the cells together. But they're so closely intercalated or stuck together that they really create a seamless surface. And on one end of this cell, we have these special fingers that go into the hollow of the intestine, because the intestine is a tube, but of course it's so much more. And there are special names for everything. And I think you can appreciate in the image, if you're able to see it in our YouTube video, that there are fingers. And these fingers are there for what? Can you guess why an intestinal cell lining the entire gut, one next to the other, next to the other, next to the other, tightly adhered to each other, would also have fingers. And I think I have another image here, although I believe it was sideways, but it showed also some detail of those fingers. And here, maybe you can appreciate that there's a little bit of a microscopic space between the fingers. By the way, this is an image on electron microscopy. It's so visually amazing, so cool. In any event, it's to increase surface area because really one of the major jobs of the intestine is to absorb nutrients as much as possible. As much as possible. Now, if there is something coming into the intestine that might be noxious to these delicate little fingers, also known as villi. At a certain threshold, these villi can actually experience damage. They can get blunted and they might not absorb nutrients very well. So, one of the cardinal phenomena of impaired intestinal function, leaky gut, increased intestinal permeability is that even with exposures to certain nutrients, we're not going to be able to assimilate them because part and parcel to the leaky gut process is damage of this complex, delicate network of villi. If you look at it in 3 dimensions, it almost looks like a shag carpet. It's really cool looking. Anyway, I think it's easier to look at in cartoon form. So I'm going to go over to this cartoon image. And here we can appreciate the cells. You can see cells tightly adhered together so that they look practically like a continuous surface with the little fingers or villi on the end that points into the gut hollow tube, also known as a lumen. And we have so much special vocabulary in medicine. So the word for those lining cells is the intestinal epithelia with a villi facing in the lumen. So that's the fingers towards the middle of the hollow tube of the intestine, there to add increased surface area. And then towards the right of this diagram, we have a schema of what happens if there's damage, and we can talk about potential drivers of this damage. And they have some suggestions in this cartoon. They have little cartoon representations of microorganisms, let's say bacteria that overgrow at a certain threshold. Their metabolic byproducts, or they themselves, can be noxious to those delicate villi. And so it can drive bacterial overgrowth. We also have toxins. I read a statistic also, I believe from Josh Axe's book. Let me cue it up here. He has this great book called Eat Dirt. And he shared a really alarming statistic, which is that our country here in the United States represents less than 2% of the world's population, but we use 24% of its pesticides. And pesticides are simultaneously reducing that microbiome, that microbial diversity that we learn more and more is part and parcel to health, and also is toxic in and of itself and can induce damage to intestinal epithelial cells, meaning the cells lining that gut, such that those tight junctions that keep each cell tightly connected to the next to create the seamless, continuous surface. Now, why would we be designed in divine, magnificent, complex architecture to have a continuous surface in the gut? And the reason is, upon my own meditations, of course, here, is that we want that transport. If you could see on this cartoon, we want transport from inside the gut lumen, that hollow inside the gut, through the intestinal epithelial cells and into the bloodstream that is hanging out just below that bottom or basement membrane surface of those cells. And if we have healthy cells, then we can actually decide what comes through. It's a barrier function. It's like your skin. When your skin is whole, you can have potential things kind of around on the surface of your skin. But when it's cut, then that barrier surface is broken and then it's easy to get irritated, right? So we have a cut in the beginning, it looks okay. But then after a while, you might see some redness and hopefully not something like pus or drainage, which means that there's an infectious process. But it's very much a skin. The way you understand your outer skin, you can understand the lining of your gut as your inner skin. And it's serving much of the same function. It's part of what we call our native immunity. It's what is protecting us and is a feature that should be turned on all the time. The way our skin is just there serving as a barrier function all the time. And when you have loss of that barrier function, famously, burns. Burns are dangerous because you have that loss of barrier function and are very prone to infection and really need expert wound care, et cetera, et cetera. So in any event, that barrier function, that ability to control what comes into the bloodstream is incredibly important for your immune system, for your nutritional health, for managing inflammation. And conversely, when you have a breach of that barrier function, intuitively, you can understand that, well, let me just add one little extra tidbit here, which is right there in the circulatory system at the bottom of those gut lining cells, those gut epithelia, you have a whole lot of immune system. And here too, the meditation is that the best defense is a good offense, right? So your immune cells are like the sum total of your defense forces, right? And the gut very much is an interface, like your outside skin interfacing with the world. So too your inner skin. In fact, your gut is really where the outside world comes in. You choose what you assimilate, what you digest. You have tons of complex mechanisms to allow you to assimilate and digest. And there are all kinds of controls, defenses around this, with the gut epithelia being key. And then right under that, you have your Department of Defense with all its subdivisions. And that is your white blood cells. And 2/3 of your immune system are there, just cruising that boundary, that front line, and patrolling, really, really patrolling. And if you have a breach in barrier, they're going to do their job. They're going to say, whoa, something is up. What are they going to do? They're going to sound an alarm. And they do that by creating an immune response. And what's important here is that at a certain threshold, that immune response is going to recruit signals, chemical signals that can serve to, if it creates a feed forward inflammatory cycle that can turn into a vicious cycle. Specifically, one important chemical mediator of that ongoing inflammatory response is a famous molecule called histamine. And histamine's job is actually what I liken to, and I've told this story at the point of care many times. Imagine the traffic police, right? So you have an emergency, you dial 911, and emergency services are dispatched to the site of the emergency, except it's me and I live in New York City and there's a traffic jam. So this is an intuitive metaphor for me. And my emergency services cannot get to the site of the problem. And so it's the histamine response that is recruited by immune cells saying, hey, there's a problem, there's a breach, there's an emergency. And it's like the traffic police in the sense that it opens up the roadways, except in the body, it's not going to do that by just shoving, road traffic aside. It's actually going to make blood vessels leaky and the gut further leaky. Histamine induces a leakiness. So at a certain threshold of immune response, you're going to start making histamine. And if histamine isn't quenched and the inflammatory response is ongoing, your body is going to be stuck with an on switch on the intestinal permeability, on the leaky gut. And that's just one mechanism, but it's to illustrate that these are things that might start kind of low and then they might smolder. But once they get turned on, they're going to be really turned on. And that's an important thing to understand. It's also important to understand that once that inflammatory process gets turned on, it does not self-quench. It does not self-quench. And so we can kind of get by for a while, and then there's going to be that feed forward, potentially subacute, insidious type process that at some point crosses over into overt physiology, be it hives, be it fatigue, be it an anemia that is discovered as underlying that fatigue, and asking ourselves, well, why are we anemic? Why do we have suboptimal assimilation of our nutrition, especially if we supplement, let's say, with those same nutrients that we are still missing that are driving anemia? That is a clue. If we're also choosing diets that are maybe not nutritionally as dense, right? So plant-based diets, this is not a philosophy. This is not a class on philosophy of diet, but just as a clinical example. If you have a plant-based diet, that's well and good. That's fine. We can speak about that in another conversation more deeply. There's so many conversations within this conversation. But then if you also have iron deficiency and you're also vegan, that can be confounding. If you also have B12 deficiency and you're also vegan, that can be confounding. But if you're vegan and you take iron and you take B12 and you're still, then that is contextually interesting. What are other things that can drive intestinal permeability? I did pull up an image here that I borrowed from Dr. Zach Bush's website. And what he really teaches is that those tight junction barriers that we've been talking about can be degraded with exposure to gluten and glyphosate, which is the main chemical in commercial herbicides like Roundup. And glyphosate is poured into our soil. It is poured into our soil. And he has these images that he took, I believe, using a kind of immunofluorescence, if I'm not mistaken, so that the gut lining is really lit up and you can see so clearly an image of gut lining, not perfect, but supported with his water solution, aqueous solution of humic acid, deep earth minerals that help heal and repair the gut, as opposed to what the gut lining looks like when it is damaged by pesticides, maybe by gluten or by so much. It's hard to tell sometimes. There's gluten itself. But when you have, and let me toggle back to that really helpful cartoon of the leaky gut, I find it incredibly helpful. When you have intestinal permeability, and then you have, let's say, food particles that are transported between cells as opposed to through cells through a compromised barrier function and into that very immune activated bloodstream, the immune system is going to react very strongly to that. If it was just a little bit at a time, the immune system would have some time to say, I wonder, is it okay? Is it not okay? But at a certain rate, at a certain clip, you might have things coming through that are perfectly fine, perfectly innocent, perfectly innocuous. It might be a piece of spinach. It might be, something wonderful like celery or chicken, whatever. But at a certain threshold, when there is increased intestinal permeability, the immune system is not going to have time to decide, is it okay? Is it not okay? It's going to just get reactive. It's going to get overwhelmed. And in so doing, it's going to say, I don't have time to decide if this is a friend or foe. I'm just going to err on the side of saying it's a foe so that I don't miss any potential foes. I cannot afford to miss the foes. And so that is the food intolerance. That is the nutrient malabsorption that we mentioned. And also, when the immune system is all kind of revved up, it can actually drive autoimmunity. There also seems to be a lot of cross-reactivity between gut epithelia and brain epithelia, so that we can start actually affecting our neurological status. This is really interesting mechanistically with the many, many neurological phenomena that we are struggling with worldwide. And certainly in the functional medicine space where people have often been going from doctor to doctor. Tragically, we just met a new member of our community who had been having lots of neurological problems, and specifically in the realm of swallowing, which is incredibly actually demanding of neurological coordination, and went to doctor after doctor after doctor after doctor, and finally got diagnosed with a variant of ALS. We started doing the deep dive, and lo and behold, glyphosate levels, my friends, incredibly, shockingly high levels of glyphosate that ravages intestinal barrier function, as we saw in that image from Zach Bush. By the way, I welcome you to really avail yourselves of these resources of Zach Bush's website. Let me go back to it to just share it with you. Intelligence of Nature, intelligenceofnature.com. And his product that helps neutralize glyphosate. I also encourage you to be proactive and maybe look at the work of EWG, that does a good job of just getting us more aware of what are the foods that are high spray, so that if you are trying to stretch your organic food dollar and you don't have maybe the options of growing or sourcing locally, I wanted to show you this resource as well, because there are consumer guides here where you can look at the top spray here, EWG's 2023 Shopper's Guide to Pesticides in Produce. And you can learn about the different things that you may have seen in the news. For example, the PFAS polluters that they have found, especially in clothing and women's alternatives to maxi pads and tampons that have these forever chemicals that are now up against our skin, and all kinds of things that we really just need to be aware of. In any event, these are all drivers of intestinal impermeability. And because it affects barrier function and the immune system and the brain, we really truly have an endless laundry list of health woes that are associated with intestinal permeability. In fact, when I'm working with someone, and especially look at this list. We mentioned ALS just recently, Alzheimer's, mood disorders, attention disorders, pervasive developmental disorders in young people, in our little people, in our tender, precious babies, autism, Candida or SIFO, small intestinal fungal overgrowth, celiac, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, chronic fatigue syndrome, obviously Crohn's, autoimmune bowel, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, fibromyalgia, gas, bloating, digestive pain, variants of irritable bowel syndrome, autoimmune Hashimoto's, IBS, lupus, metabolic syndrome, migraines, multiple sclerosis, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and other liver malfunction, Parkinson's, polycystic ovarian syndrome that we've spoken about in another conversation. I mean, the list just goes on. Certainly skin, all kinds of allergies and sensitivities. So we mentioned drivers. We mentioned environmental factors such as pesticides, especially glyphosate, all eyes on glyphosate. Many cases in court at this point that have been won proving that it is a known carcinogen, even though our regulatory agencies have denied that. We are still winning in court. Thank you to our incredible lawyers who are standing up for people who have innocently used these products. In fact, every time I go to the nursery, I see it on the shelves, and it just absolutely makes me shudder, knowing what I know in clinical practice, seeing the cancer and the levels of glyphosate in people's systems, seeing the devastating neurological disease and levels of glyphosate in people's system, and having this stuff sold freely on the shelves in our marketplaces. It's just inconceivable, honestly. It's just such a cruelty. I think part of healing on purpose is just getting really, really conscious about what we need to look out for. I welcome people to really, and what's interesting, glyphosate is a urine test. And so if you check your first morning urine, there are specialty labs, Mosaic being one. And folks, it is not very expensive. I think it is coming in at the $100 mark, just under the $100 mark. believe there are direct-to-consumer labs, or you can find doctors who work in the functional medicine space. Start taking ion biome, start buying, lower pesticide foods, and open up your eyes. Get onto websites like the Environmental Working Group. Maybe grab yourself, look at Dr. Zach Bush's research. And maybe you want to grab this wonderful book called Eat Dirt by Dr. Josh Axe, who teaches all about leaky gut and what are the drivers of it. So he says here, why is this happening? Corruption of our food supply, rise of environmental toxins, the overwhelming stress of modern life, largely also driven not just by the pace of everything and the past few years and what we're fielding, but also the stress of those exposures, those environmental exposures, as stress in and of itself. And then we have what he calls unrelenting germ warfare. Well, what we're talking about here is our fear of germs. What a poignant time in 2023 to be speaking about this. Because what have we been slathering or encouraged to slather ourselves with, these past several years? All the Lysols and the alcohols that not only knock out our outer microbiome, but really have been shown to drastically reduce our inner bacterial diversity that is part and parcel to our immune protection. It's part of our native immunity. Imagine this. You're surrounded by wonderful people and friends and family, and maybe there's that one kind of oddball person in your circles, but you're surrounded by so many wonderful people whose company you enjoy. You have tolerance. You have that ability to tolerate someone who's a little bit eccentric. But what if all of your wonderful friends and family couldn't come to the mixer or to the cousin's party, but the one who's a little bit eccentric does come? And you wind up, just because there are less people around, spending a lot of time with them, and it becomes a little too much. I mean, in this case, I'm speaking about a very benign scenario, but it might not be so benign if you reduce what we call competitive inhibition. You have so many good bugs around you that the bad ones just can't get in edgewise. They can't even slip in their 2 cents because they're surrounded by so many good ones. But what if we knock all the good ones out with things like Purell, Purell, Purell? I mean, for some, what I'm saying might be hearsay, and for others, this is common sense. But we lose competitive inhibition. And so that's that germ warfare. We've killed off many strains of beneficial microbes that used to fine-tune our genes and strategically train our immune systems to handle pathogens and allergens and other threatening forces in the environment, both because they help biotransform those, or they, that mechanism that I mentioned of competitive inhibition. Certain medications directly damage, our nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. That's our Advils and our Tylenol, short-term fine. We depend on them, not so fine. Antibiotics, especially with frequent use, especially without replenishing with probiotics afterwards, which hopefully has become a reflex. But if not, I want each of you to reflex to that. You can't avoid it. You need an antibiotic. After it's done, you can reflex to a probiotic. Of course, now we can also measure our actual microbial diversity. We have such amazing technology at our fingertips. We have so much more we can know, and that functional gut testing is really helpful, especially if you're someone who's driven by data and really enjoys the numbers and really enjoys the concrete. You can practice such rich evidence-based medicine in our field. It's really just phenomenal. So what are some other talking points? The solution is simple, yes, and yes, but it starts with consciousness. What else can I tell you about intestinal permeability? What I wanted to do is rewind a little bit to histamine. As I mentioned in an earlier part of this conversation on leaky gut or increased intestinal permeability, we discussed its role with inflammation, with nutrient malabsorption that can lead to fatigue and anemia. And I mentioned one of those possible mechanisms when the immune system gets all revved up of driving histamine, and that histamine in and of itself drives intestinal permeability. So you create these feed-forward cycles. I wanted to just expand on histamine a little more. It's an incredibly important subject. Because we have histamine receptors, because it's part of our immune system, we need that immune response all over our body. We have histamine receptors in our gut, obviously, in our brain, in our lungs, in our skin, in our entire vascular tree, our circulatory system, and in our lungs. And so because we have histamine receptors will manifest histamine activation in different cells, different parts of our body differently. And so if we are in our gut, we can have leaky gut and we can develop food allergies, create a feed-forward cycle because the allergies will drive histamine. And that will create a intestinal permeability reaction that might be baseline and exacerbated or made worse by exposure to food allergies, allergens, and based on the food allergies we develop. Oftentimes, when we have intestinal permeability, the things we become reactive to are the things that we have a lot of. Even more so if the things that we have a lot of in and of themselves are high in pesticides. By the way, conventional oats. My friends, this means Cheerios. This means that healthy oat milk that's not organic. This means granola bars. This means oatmeal. All of these foods that we crave and that are comforting and that are health foods in the land of glyphosate and in our complicated times, they're not so safe. They're not so safe. And we're feeding these foods to our babies. We're literally training babies how to play with solid foods using Cheerios. And this stuff has started to be poured into our soil in the 90s. So people like me who were teenagers in the 80s and 90s and grew up with just an emotional tie to these things, part of our childhood, part of our memories. We want to share that love and those memories and those warm and fuzzy, cooler mornings with a yummy oatmeal. We've got to be aware that oat milk is a dairy substitute. We've got to be aware. It is also my understanding that certain plants, legumes, the pulses, the lentils and whatnot, and the grains have an affinity for because of their root systems and because glyphosate or Roundup is water soluble, have an affinity and concentrate certain pesticides within themselves. And oats, it just makes me cry. But what makes me cry even more is the innocence of my brothers and sisters going out there. We just want to enjoy our lives. I don't want this to bite you in the butt. I want you to know. I want you to investigate. I want you to become empowered. I want you to heal on purpose. Back to histamine. Histamine, because it has all those receptors and all those different parts of the body, it can have very variable symptoms. And so it can be that runny nose, that itchy nose, those kind of rhinitis, chronic rhinitis can be one of its manifestations, and itchy eyes. It can be hives. It can be hyperreactive airways, along the asthma spectrum. It can be, this is a big one, reflux. Another really big one, right? And so, by the way, what do we do when we have reflux? We take antacids. And what do antacids do? Well, they prevent acid from being manufactured in the stomach from our parietal cells that produce hydrochloric acid. And then that acid that allows us to digest and break down our food, but is also part of our native immunity and naturally antimicrobial, gets suppressed. And so that in and of itself, as we swallow food that's not sterile, can lead to us swallowing microbes and developing small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is a big underlying driver of irritable bowel syndrome. I mean, we just drive ourselves by taking medication symptomatically deeper and deeper and deeper into the hole. And there's no way out unless you understand intestinal permeability, unless you understand what drives small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, unless you understand that histamine can drive hydrochloric acid hyperproduction, and that you don't need an acid suppressant. What you need is to help your body metabolize histamine. And what you need is to restore your microbiome. And what you need is to restore your digestive function and take away the food allergens and restore barrier function. That's what you need. You need root cause exploration and, by God's grace, resolution. You need this information. You need these tools. You need this insight. That's why we're here. That's why we're here. That's why we're teaching. That's why we're sharing. That's why we're showing some of these resources to help you get on that pathway to healing on purpose, where you say, I will not buy conventional oat-based products anymore. I will know what my glyphosate level is. I will do a functional gut test and I will know what the breakdown of my microbiome is. I will learn about the positive role of digestive enzymes. I will learn about the enzyme that breaks histamine down in my gut to allow me to heal and seal my gut, diamine oxidase. I will learn about the role of a biotransformative pathway in the body called methylation, which will also necessarily be the subject of another conversation that also helps break down histamine. I mean, there is just so much, but we've got to start somewhere. And we've got to really, really anchor this for you, that there is hope, that there is rhyme, that there is reason, that there is logic, that there is a pathway. So it starts with you saying, there's this thing called leaky gut. What does it mean? What might it mean for me? What are the drivers potentially for me? Do I have histamine intolerance? Do I have IBS? Do I have glyphosate toxicity? Do I have chronic stress? Do I react very badly to alcohol, which is one of the signs of histamine intolerance? Do I have migraines? Do I have headaches? That's a sign of histamine intolerance at the level of the brain. Do I have insomnia? It's a potential sign of histamine intolerance at the level of the brain. Do I have GERD? Do I have chronic rhinitis, itchy eyes, and runny nose? Do I react to lots and lots of foods, especially alcohol, especially fermented alcohol, beer, wine, champagne? Do I tolerate vinegars and pickles? Do I tolerate smoked meats and smelly cheeses? Is there a pattern here? Is there a pattern? Have you ever heard of histamine intolerance? You can ask a provider. What do you know about histamine intolerance? What do you know about increased intestinal permeability? What do you know about the root cause of IBS and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, small intestinal fungal overgrowth, the cross-reactivity between our intestinal permeability and our brain? Leaky gut, leaky brain, leaky skin. These are pathways of inquiry. And there's so much to cover here. There's so much to cover here. But I just wanted to get this preliminary conversation out. And I wanted to ask my community out there, on your path to healing on purpose, what deep dive would you like me to take? Further into histamine intolerance, further into IBS, further into SIBO, further into autoimmunity. I plan to do all of these. Further into potential pathways for supplementation, pathways into gut mucosal healing. I would love for this to be a catalyst for more and more and more conversations on the pathway to healing on purpose, with intention, with empowerment, with curiosity, and with a tremendous amount of hope and love. Because healing must be on purpose. It is on purpose. And together we can grow tikkun, repair of the world, of our health, and return to wholeness. And in so doing, grow and inhabit and bloom in a vision of joyful peace together. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I look forward to speaking again soon on the path to healing on purpose. Thanks for listening to the Healing on Purpose podcast today. I hope you found this information helpful, and I encourage you to share this episode with others who may also benefit from the information shared. Please consider rating and reviewing my podcast on Apple Podcasts so more people can find this information. I also invite you to join the Healing on Purpose podcast Facebook group, to continue this conversation. I'll see you there.